The waters that lay off the island's coast were perfectly still, barely a breath of wind passing across their surface, so much so that the light from the full moon that shone down overhead was reflected back in an unsullied and almost mirror-like state. But moments later, an enormous metallic shape silently rose up from the depths below, making little sound, save for the great torrents of water that now flowed back down along its sleek lines, rushing to rejoin the seas below. Any observer would have been dumbfounded by the scale of the vessel, the largest submarine ever to have been constructed. But as had been carefully planned by her captain and crew, there were no witnesses to this event, save themselves. A number of hatches silently popped open, and several khaki-clad sailors hurried across towards the gigantic pressure door that protruded from beneath the submarine's conning tower. As they did so, their commander watched on from above, his heart filling with pride. Despite the cutting-edge technology that had been used to construct the I-401, it had still taken him and his crew the best part of 2 months to make the long journey to the east coast of the United States from their naval base in Curie. They had followed their orders to the letter, avoiding contact with any other vessels and remaining submerged for as long as possible, resulting in hellish working conditions. But such subterfuge had been necessary to shield the existence of the submarine and her 2 sister ships from the enemy. Now, seeing his men working diligently beneath him, Lieutenant Commander Nambu was more convinced than ever their mission would be a success. They had arrived, undetected, at the heart of their enemy's homeland, carrying a weapon that could conceivably alter the course of the war. Below him, the pressure door to the specifically constructed hangar that ran the length of the deck was now open. But for this mission, there were no planes inside. Instead, 2 men wearing lab coats emerged, visibly relieved to be exposed to the cool night air that welcomed them. As they did so, 3 sailors hauled a heavy sack of long metal tubing past them, up to the ship's bow, then began to bolt the pieces together. Quickly, the shape of a large raft became apparent, complete with an accompanying set of long metal oars. Turning away, the lieutenant commander called down the tower, ensuring the ship's radar was detecting no surface contacts nearby. Satisfied with the reply, he then conferred with the lookouts, who stated there was no sign of enemy aircraft either. Content, Nambu took up his own binoculars to scan the nearby coastline, his gaze taking in the settlements and the townships located a little further down along the coast. To his amazement, there was no evidence of a blackout in place, the seafront ablaze with light pouring from buildings and motor vehicles, the faint sounds of music audible, floating out across the sea. Sighing to himself, the Japanese submariner wondered how it was this nation of hedonists had proven such tenacious opponents. They seemed to have no concept of danger, or to believe his people could reach out from halfway around the world to strike at them. But tonight, all that would change. Turning his attention back to the deck, Nambu saw the metal raft was now complete, and had been lowered into the water to float just off the bow. Below him, the 2 scientists were still casually unpacking various items from inside their crates, seeming to have no care in the world. For a moment, he considered descending to reason with them, to explain that every minute spent on the surface increased the risk they would be detected. But what little contact he'd had with them during their trip so far made him realize his words would have been wasted. The pair had remained inside the hangar for the majority of the journey, sleeping and taking their meals inside. On the few occasions they had emerged to dine with him and his fellow officers, their open disdain had made for uncomfortable conversation. Like most Japanese military officers, he'd heard rumors of the mysterious Unit 731 and the secretive experiments they conducted. But it had always proven difficult to believe such stories, particularly when none came from actual eyewitnesses, only unfolding from second-hand testimony. Suddenly, a large and imposing shape unfolded itself from beneath the hangar beneath him, emerging out into the submarine's bow. For a moment, the sailors around it stopped, clearly struggling to take in the size of the newcomer, before warily returning to their duties. The figure walked forward unsteadily, before dropping down onto one knee alongside the scientists, still towering above them even whilst kneeling. The pair began to inject a series of syringes into its arms and neck, before then motioning for several crewmen to join them. Nambu watched as his men removed the armour plating from the crates stacked on the deck, affixing and strapping it to the great warrior that knelt beside them. Gradually, as each massive metal piece was bolted into place, the man began to resemble a hulking samurai warrior of old. Whilst Nambu disliked the scientists and their haughty attitude, he couldn't help but be overawed by what they had created. Now fully armoured, the giant soldier below him rose to its feet. It was handed an equally imposing sword, which it solemnly accepted, sheathing it within a scabbard built into one of the armoured leg plates. There was a brief conversation between the scientists and their charge, before he nodded, and then walked slowly up to the bow. Whatever they had injected with him now had clearly been effective, as any trace of his previous unsteadiness was gradually absent. The warrior stepped down onto the waiting raft, grabbing hold of the oars, and then pushing off briskly into the darkness. Nambu followed his passenger's progress before he disappeared from view, rowing steadily towards the peninsula they were lying off. Once the crates were packed and stowed inside the hangar, and the door was again secure, he allowed the rest of the crew for a brief spell upon deck. Their commander watched on as his men gratefully inhaled huge lungfuls of the cold nighttime air, before then duly re-entering the sub. As he climbed down the conning tower, the hatch above him clanging shut, Nambu then called for the executive officers to join him in the control room. Their primary mission complete, his orders now allowed him to again act with a degree of discretion, which meant careful planning for their next move. The trip from the submarine to the shore took several minutes before the metal raft finally made contact with the soft particulate of the sandy beach. Rising to his feet, the sole occupant stepped off onto American soil, before slowly and carefully surveying his immediate surroundings. Casting his mind back, he found he struggled to remember much beyond his admission to the test program. There were distant and hazy memories of a woman he believed might be his mother, and a simple, rural home that had once sat beside a farmer's field. But then the soldiers had come, and his life had been changed forever. He had been renamed Katsura, meaning victory, and told that he was of great importance to the future of his people. Once the procedures had started, any remembrance of his previous existence had gradually then been burned away. For months, he had been subjected to more surgical treatments and chemical injections than he could remember. He had felt his body growing and expanding beyond its previous capabilities, becoming larger and stronger with each passing day. There were endless exercises and tests, the metal weights he had to lift, and the opponents he was forced to fight becoming progressively heavier and stronger. He had been forced to kill men, and in doing so had found that he now had little empathy for anyone or anything, only a burning desire to please his masters. And then he had been led to the submarine, forced to lie for weeks in the cramped hangar, as the ghosts and demons of his past threatened to claim him every evening. But each time he had become angered or unnerved by the memories, the scientists were there, injecting something inside him to make him forget. One of his giant metal gauntlets rose up to touch the row of tubing built into the armour's left shoulder plate. Within them lay more syringes of the stimulant needed to complete his task. He had been informed that much rested on this mission, with the war potentially ended more quickly were he to succeed. With a solemn grunt, Katsura walked up the beach, searching for the nearest sign of life. There, half a mile away, shone the lights of a building, burning brightly in the darkness. His left hand resting on the hilt of the massive sword that was strapped to his leg, the Japanese warrior strode on purposefully now, heading towards his target. The phone had started to sound just as Holt had been on the verge of settling down his son for the third attempt that evening. Unsurprisingly, the shrill and insistent ringing had instantly woken the boy, who had instinctively started to cry out for his mother. The bedroom door opened and Sarah emerged, bleary-eyed, automatically reaching out for their son. She ignored the helpless and apologetic look he offered, instead resigning herself to yet another evening spent with their infant, restlessly twitching alongside her in bed. As the door closed, Holt sheepishly picked up the receiver, to hear Janie, the switchboard operator, apologising for disturbing him. After a brief chat about how much of a pain his son was being, she informed him that Mr. Oliver had called again to report strange lights out in the water near his house. Holt sighed, mentally cursing the old man for placing the call to the police that had now woken his son. Oliver had insistently called the Bald Island Police Department twice a week since the outbreak of war to report suspicious submarines, enemy air activity, or invading paratroopers. Every time, without substance. They should have ignored such calls, but then Mr. Oliver also had a habit of causing trouble at the monthly public meetings. The chief had been quick to point out to Holt and the other officers on the island that as there was precious little else going on, the trip down to listen to the old man's rantings was not too much to ask. Hanging up, Holt dialed up for his partner for the evening to let him know that he too would be going out to visit their regular caller. But Officer Donaldson wouldn't hear a word of it, insisting Holt stay home with his young family, while he instead went out to deal with old man Oliver. Replacing the receiver, Holt glanced across at the jacket and equipment belt that sat waiting in the kitchen corner, and then across again to the closed bedroom door. Deciding fresh air would be preferable to the risk of another phone call, he then slipped on his uniform and quietly left the house. When Holt got to his cruiser, he used the radio to let Janie know he'd be out and again, and not to call the house. Perhaps realising the grief she'd inadvertently caused, the girl was apologetic now, promising she would use the radio and not the phone for the rest of the evening. Fully aware that Donaldson would likely have arrived at the old man's house by now, Holt decided to head across that way too. Perhaps a show of force from the island's police department might appease the old man and deter him from making any further calls that week. Although she should have been asleep in bed some time ago, Lavinia Burnett was instead seated at the top of the stairs in her house, straining to catch the hushed conversation taking place between her parents in the living room below her. Early that day, she'd been sat outside in the process of writing her journal, when her father had re-entered their yard, the bloody carcasses of 2 coyotes slung across his shoulder. For a moment, she'd wondered if he'd recovered them from one of his traps, only to then catch sight of the torn throats hanging from each of the animals. The incident had not been spoken of at dinner that evening, and it was only when they believed she was tucked up in bed that she had heard her parents discussing it. Her mother worried, asking her father to call the police to inform them of the dead animals. But Darrell Burnett would hear none of it, stating that for years he had found such carcasses deposited in the vicinity of the farm, and not once had anything from the nearby swamp approach them or threaten their house. If there was indeed someone residing there, or something, they only seemed to be being neighbourly. It was at school that Lavinia had first heard the stories of the monster that had long ago made its home in the dense stretch of swampland, situated a short distance from the Burnett homestead. The older children had teased her, telling that one night the monster would come for her and abduct her while she was sleeping. Despite her father's insistence that the legend was a tall tale, cooked up by drunks in the local bar to cover for their shenanigans, the girl had always believed that something or someone did indeed reside within the dark and foreboding undergrowth she could see from her bedroom window. She would often feel as though a pair of eyes were observing her from within the impenetrable tree line as she carried out her chores or played in the yard. And yet she'd never once felt in any kind of danger, or that their owner meant her any harm. As the conversation below now turned to more mundane matters, Lavinia's interest in it naturally waned. Creeping back to her bedroom, she took one last look out of her window at the moonlit landscape outside, before closing her curtains and settling down to bed. And as the young girl did so, a hulking figure now emerged from the tree line of the swamp, staring keenly at the lights that shone from the nearby house. The moment he brought the cruiser to a halt, Officer Donaldson had known that something was very wrong. The front door to the old man's beachside house was hanging wide open from its hinges, the wooden frame surrounding it completely broken and splintered. Unholstering his revolver, the officer crept cautiously forward as the chaotic scene inside the house gradually became visible through the open doorway. Tables and chairs were overturned. The remains of an evening meal lay strewn across the floor, and slumped in the corner of the kitchen was the old man himself. Clay Donaldson gasped as he saw that the bloody body had been cleaved virtually in two, a huge wound extending from the right shoulder down to the left hip, Death must have been instantaneous, Oliver's face frozen in a grisly mask of terror and pain. Leading away from the blood that had pooled around the remains were a pair of huge footprints, which led back out of the door and off into the night. Once he had satisfied himself the killer was no longer present, Clay hurried back to the cruiser to call for his partner. Holt Mitchell had picked up straight away, listening in bewilderment to the gabbled and terrified tale related by his panicked colleague. Quickly mapping out in his head where the nearest household to the residence would be, he called for Donaldson to meet him there. But when he arrived, Holt realised that he was too late. Here again, the doors to the premises had been brutally kicked to pieces, with Don and Sylvia Small senselessly hacked to death in their kitchen whilst they had been eating dinner. Seconds later, Donaldson screeched up to a halt behind him, his face falling as he exited his car to see an all too familiar sight. The two officers stood and regarded the large bloodied footprints that again led away from the crime scene off into the night, before hurriedly piling into Holt's cruiser and speeding towards the next nearest residence, the Burnett household. Lavinia had found herself struggling to settle, the sight of the two torn and mutilated coyotes dominating her thoughts. She rose and ventured out onto the landing, considering her parents' reaction were she to go downstairs and ask if she could sit with them a while. She was still debating this course of action when the side door to the house suddenly splintered inwards below her, violently rebounding off the wall behind it. By the time her father had jumped up to his feet, a gigantic and nightmarish figure had already stepped into the kitchen, the light inside bounding off the imposing armour that adorned it. Darrell Burnett had just enough time to turn to his wife and scream for her to run, before he was impaled on the katana, the force of the impact lifting him up, completely off his feet. The warrior strode on, Burnett's remains dangling helplessly from the blade of the massive weapon, before he contemptuously heaved it to one side, allowing the man's lifeless body to fall down to the floor. As Katsura now turned, he saw Mrs. Burnett running for the stairs, desperate to reach her daughter. With a stride, he was upon her, one savage backhand sending her sideways against the staircase. The force of the blow sent the hapless woman stumbling to one side, and she slumped down helplessly against a chair. But as he raised his sword to deliver the killer blow, the samurai was suddenly knocked off balance by a sharp and unexpected impact to his back. Turning slowly, he saw a young girl wearing a nightdress stood behind him on the stairs, wisps of smoke still curling from the barrel of the shotgun she held in her hands. Lowering the sword, he stepped across the room to the bottom stair, the cruel smile that had now spread across his features concealed behind the metal visor that masked them from the girl. She fired again, directly into the advancing figure's face. The armoured faceplate deflected the majority of the shot, save for several fragments that penetrated the right eye hole, lacerating the eye beneath it. With a grunt of pain, Katsura instinctively clapped a hand up to the injury, stumbling backwards slightly as he did. In an instant, Lavinia was quickly past him, down the stairs and across the room to where her mother lay. Having hauled the stunned woman to her feet, she abandoned her father's rifle, before the two terrified females lurched across the room, out through the remains of the shattered door. Behind them, their assailant reached across to his shoulder, removed a metal syringe from one of the tubes there, before plunging it down into a gap between the armour plating on his right leg. The pain in his eye quickly faded, clarity and resolve flowing once again into his mind. Rising to his feet, Katsuro sheathed the sword, striding purposefully to the door in pursuit of his prey. But as he stepped out into the cold night air, he was again stopped in his tracks as several bullets suddenly impacted into his chest, ricocheting harmlessly off the thick metal armour that protected it. The moment the armoured figure had stepped out of the broken door, Donaldson and Mitchell had simultaneously opened fire. They continued to hammer round after round into the samurai, whilst Lavinia and her mother struggled past them, heading off down the long drive that ran away from the property. Their revolvers now empty, Holt instinctively ducked back into the cruiser for the shotgun that lay there, whilst Donaldson crouched down for the backup piece he routinely kept holstered to his ankle. But as the older officer rose up from behind the cover of the vehicle, snub-nosed pistol grasped firmly in his hand, something sharp and metallic suddenly slammed into the side of his neck. Holt Mitchell turned to see his partner reeling backwards, one hand weakly trying to staunch a seemingly unending flow of crimson blood that was now pouring around the thick metal throwing star buried in his throat. With a roar of anger, Holt fired the shotgun at their attacker, repeatedly pumping new rounds into the chamber until the weapon was empty, before crouching down to help his fallen colleague. Seeing that any trace of life had long departed Officer Donaldson, Holt snatched up the man's pistol and turned, drawing a bead on the killer. But to his horror, he saw the enormous metal figure was now charging directly towards him. In just a few massive steps, the samurai was on him, swatting him aside with a murderous blow from a brawny arm. The young officer flew backwards, connecting sharply with the bodywork of the vehicle that he had been crouched by. There was a sickening and audible crunch as the force of the impact shattered several bones. Then he was still. The attacker stood for a moment, scanning his victims for signs of life, before turning to survey his surroundings, looking for the two women. In a moment he saw them, still labouring away from the house. With a satisfied grunt, he now set off in pursuit. As the gunfire behind her ceased, Lavinia turned to see if she could see what had taken place. There was no sign of the two officers, only the thing that had murdered her father and tried to take the lives of her and her mother. And that monster was now once again in pursuit of her, quickly gaining ground. Looking around to see how much distance remained between them and the main road, she realised her mother could not outrun the killer, forcing her to make a decision. Veering off to the left of the track, still struggling to keep her mother upright, Lavinia made for the swamp. Katsuro watched on with interest as the two fleeing women suddenly changed course, disappearing into the dense undergrowth that bordered the path they had been travelling along. Pausing to consider his options, he was pleased to discover that full eyesight was now returning to his injured eye. If he allowed the females to escape, there was a chance they would alert the authorities more quickly than he intended, leading to an open conflict with the military units that would surely come. That said, it was his mission to spread anxiety and fear into these people, and so perhaps to allow this could be the right course of action. But the fact the girl had successfully injured him, even if only temporarily, angered the Japanese warrior. A deep fire burned within him, an overwhelming urge to cause the girl the same pain that she had caused him. Unable to resist the thrill of the pursuit that had now built up inside him, Katsuro now strode forwards, penetrating the foliage in search of his prey. The ground around here was sodden, and it proved easy enough to detect the footprints of the two fleeing women. As he moved deeper into the swamp, the Japanese soldier found the going slow, the thick mud sucking his bulky frame down deeper with each step. But however much of an effort it was for him to sustain this speed, he remained confident he would outpace his victims. The outcome in this matter would be inevitable. Back up at the Burnett residence, Officer Mitchell reflexively yelped in pain as he regained consciousness, his right arm dangling uselessly from the shattered shoulder it was connected to. As he struggled up to his feet, paralysing bolts of pain seemed to lance outwards from every bone in his back. But the patrolman forced himself up, stumbling against the side of the cruiser, struggling to open the door with his working arm. Slumping down inside, he fumbled for the radio set with his working hand, pleading for Janie to answer. The girl immediately broke down as he told her what had taken place. She knew him well enough to understand this was no game, and no prank he'd cooked up. Promising to get help, she signed off, leaving him alone once again. Ignoring the intense agony that was rocketing between his shoulder and his spine, Holt levered himself back up and out of the vehicle, determined to find something to cover Donaldson's body. He'd just finished laying down the waterproof poncho he'd fumbled to retrieve from the back of the cruiser's trunk, when an almighty roar carried out across the night sky from somewhere within the depths of the neighbouring swamp. For the briefest of moments, Holt Mitchell thought of his wife and of his infant son. Their faces in the event an officer just like himself unexpectedly arrived at their front door to inform them of his death. Then he remembered the bodies of the slain residents and the haunted expression of Lavinia Burnett as she had struggled past him, carrying her mother in a desperate bid to escape. With a heavy heart, he slumped down and began to reload the shotgun. Lavinia had only travelled a short distance before the futility of her situation had become horribly apparent. Barefoot, dressed in her nightclothes and barely able to shoulder her mother's weight, she made little progress through the lengthy stretches of shallow muck. Emerging from the thick clumps of trees into a clearing, The girl collapsed down against a thick tree trunk, her mother slumping to the ground alongside her. For the briefest of moments she convinced herself they were now safe, that they had lost their pursuer. And then there was a loud crashing sound behind them as a huge tree was forcibly pushed aside, tumbling noisily to the ground. The light from the full moon above danced across the surface of the killer's armour as it stepped out into the clearing. It halted, regarding her, and then unsheathed its sword, still stained with the blood of her father. Utterly broken, the girl began to sob uncontrollably, realising there was no chance of survival for her or for her barely conscious mother. Suddenly, a deafening bellow echoed around the clearing, taking all three of the protagonists there by complete surprise. The warrior's head turned, this way and that, searching for the source of the cry, and then a dark shape stepped out from the shadows. Lavinia's eyes opened wide in a mixture of horror and surprise as the newcomer's features were illuminated by a patch of passing moonlight. It was huge, easily as big as the hulking samurai warrior that stalked them, and it looked like nothing she had ever seen before. The creature walked upright, on two legs, which supported a rippling and muscular torso, but it was completely covered in a thick layer of scaly hide, much like those of the alligators that lurked in the more remote areas of the swamp they lived alongside. The thick tail that extended out behind it swished back and forth as it stepped forward into the clearing, opening its arms wide. It fixed the armoured warrior with a hungry stare, and then screamed again, flexing the claws at the end of its hands. Katsura stood, staring at the entity in amazement, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. For the briefest of moments, a distant memory from his childhood escaped the fog of the past. An old woman, relating a story of a shape-shifting dragon that dwelt in the waters near where they lived. As quickly as it manifested itself, the memory was then gone, lost in a fog of half-thoughts and shadowy whispers, those that remained of his past. Staring again at the creature and its aggressive stance, the message it sent him was clear and unambiguous. The soldier slowly and deliberately sheathed his sword, all the time holding the stare of his opponent. Reaching down to the rear of the armour, he withdrew the two tanto blades that were housed there. Lavinia watched as the metal giant extended one of the daggers outwards in an unmistakable act of invitation, before dropping back into a fighting stance. The monster before it needed no encouragement, surging forward to attack. It was the warrior who drew first blood, burying a blade into the shoulder of the beast, and then another into its hip, before heaving it clear. But as he did so, one of the knives went with the creature, stuck fast in its thick hide. The dragon hissed loudly, tearing the human weapon from its shoulder, pitching it off to one side and then attacking again. This time, it easily skipped past the scything arc of the blade that was offered, slashing back in reply with its claws. Its talons connected with a gap between the armoured plates and the warrior's right arm, cutting down deep, severing muscle and sinew. The soldier grunted, stepping back, one arm dangling now uselessly to one side. Sensing victory, the monster launched itself forward a third time, jaws open, aiming for Katsuro's throat. But the samurai was able to block the move with its good arm, the momentum of the attack sending the two tumbling down to the wet ground below. Staring up at the jaws that were snapping away, just centimetres from his face, Katsuro lowered his arm and then headbutted the creature as hard as he could. It immediately recoiled, screeching in pain, teeth falling from its mouth under the impact of the heavy armour, before falling backwards. Angry that he'd been disgraced by allowing himself to be down by this abomination, the Japanese warrior rose, quickly injecting a further dose of serum into his injured arm. Before the monster could right itself, he was already across the ground and upon it, driving his remaining dagger deep into its heart. The beast twitched for a few seconds, before its body then went limp, the warrior swearing contemptuously, before turning, raising the dagger, pointing it towards the terrified girl sat a short distance away. Lavinia Burnett screamed in terror, using her final moments praying for another miracle, anything that could save her and her mother. From the corner of her eye, she saw a dark shape slowly rising up behind the samurai. Ignoring the horrified expression, Katsuro instead strode forward, to end the encounter. It was his focus on the girl that would end his life, blinding him to the thick, scaly hands that now gripped him, coiling round his neck from behind. His eyes bulged and his lungs hammered as an impossible force began to lift his head up. He grabbed out at the creature's hands, but his left arm was still not fully healed, and it resisted his efforts. Blood began to pour now from his mouth, then his nose, then his eyes. In moments it was over. The killer's head fully separated from his shoulders, tossed to one side, his armoured body falling noisily to the ground below. The nightmarish creature raised its face to look at the moon above, and then bellowed in victory, before turning to face the two women. Lavinia watched on as it knelt down, retrieving one of the Japanese soldier's daggers, before walking slowly across the clearing towards her. Unable to avert her gaze, she stared as the monster knelt down alongside her, before pressing the weapon into her hands. For a second it looked at her, slowly and silently, before rising, walking back to the headless corpse. It retrieved the metal helmet, complete with the gory contents inside, and then took hold of one of the corpse's legs, before walking off silently away from the clearing, deeper into the swamp, towards its home. When Holt staggered into the clearing moments later, struggling to hold the shotgun with his one good arm, he was bewildered to see the two women still alive. With a cry, the girl rose, running to him, her embrace welcome, despite the sharp jolt of pain it sent through his entire body. He looked down at her, asking her where the killer was, bewildered by her reply. It was gone. It would never trouble them again. Several minutes later, they revived her mother, before turning, hurrying out of the swamp, heading back for civilization. Despite their best efforts, the paratroopers that arrived from Fort Bragg found no trace of the killer, or the monster the girl described, despite several days of searching the swamp. Over time, her story would be put down to the overactive imaginations of a local population, the conclusion being that whatever Japanese units had come ashore had lost their lives when they'd gone deeper into the swamp. The matter was then quietly made to go away, in order to prevent a wider panic. But sometimes, when her mother slept restlessly inside the house, Lavinia Burnett would leave, sitting on the porch, and on occasion, she would catch a glimpse of something in the shadows of the swamp, something that watched over her, and for its presence, she was grateful.